Ladies, thank you for joining us once again for another Money Monday. As you know, each and every week, what we try and do is bring you some information, either for you to make good financial decisions for you personally, but as you're growing businesses, because we have a number of ladies here that are business owners or aspiring business owners. We want to make sure that you have access to as much information as possible because information is so valuable. We have a great speaker with us today. Our speaker, Tahir Johnson, is a membership manager and DEI coordinator for the National Cannabis Industry Association. He is responsible for driving membership and expanding the organization's presence on the East Coast. Prior to joining NCIA, Tahir spent most of his career in wealth management and had clients that included corporate executives, entertainers, business owners, and other high net worth individuals. As I always say, it's always great to have an opportunity to pivot, and part of financial independence is being able to take the risk and make a change. So thank you for showing us that that is possible. He began his career with Morgan Stanley, where he served on the Diversity Council. Passionate about cannabis, he left his career as a financial advisor and began working as a patient counselor and social media director at a local dispensary. Having started several ancillary businesses along with his experience as part of a team that he's applied for cultivation and processing licenses, he also has unique insight into the needs and challenges of business owners in the industry. How cool is that? And so I just want to start off, and I think the first question I'll start with is tell us a little bit about kind of the state of the industry today, and then what we're looking at for and I know a lot of things are kind of uncertain in this current climate, but what are we thinking that we're going to see in the next maybe year to 5 years as well?
Sure. So first, I'll say it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, given the opportunity to come back and talk to you ladies. For me, as somebody who, as was noted, spent most of my professional career in finance, it's always a pleasure when I get to bring the two together and talk about money a little bit when we're talking about this industry. So to put it in the proper perspective, first I'll set the stage with where the first question you asked and where could it be going. Currently on the ballot next tomorrow, we have 5 states with cannabis on the ballot. We have New Jersey, Mississippi, Montana, Arizona, and Oregon, all with measures to legalize cannabis. Now, some of those are some conservative states that you might not have imagined. One thing that's important to note is that New Jersey is overwhelmingly expected to pass. And for those of us here on the East Coast, it's expected that that would be the first domino in a wave of legalization kind of here on the East Coast. Also, concurrently, we have what's called the MORE Act, which is currently waiting to be voted on in Congress, which could potentially legalize cannabis on a national level, as well as other bills like the Safe Banking Act, which was included in the coronavirus relief bill, which would essentially legalize cannabis banking for cannabis businesses. So to give you an idea of what the cannabis industry is currently valued at, so right now globally, the cannabis industry, as of 2018, the legal cannabis industry brought in about $344 billion in revenue. So to give you an idea of what that looks like, I'm going to give you the value of a couple different industries, right? So the fragrance, deodorant, antiperspirant market is $75 billion. The video game market is $125 billion. I know we probably have some wine drinkers on here. The global wine market is $302 billion. Cosmetics is $532 billion, just a little bit more than cannabis. And the beer market is $593 billion. So we have cannabis, even currently today, as it still stands federally illegal, bringing in more revenue than wine, video games, fragrances, and the global box office. That's when you put it in that type of perspective, it's crazy to think about, right? In the U.S. here alone, as of last year, the U.S. cannabis industry brought in about $13 billion in revenue between medical and adult use sales, and the U.S. industry is projected to be worth about $30 billion by 2025. So those are just some of the high level numbers of like where we're going in revenue and kind of where the market is going in terms of like a legalization standpoint.
Now, as we think about in that respect, because that's more so taken into account what is kind of above ground. So that doesn't even take into account everything else that's going on. And you touched on one big part about, and I didn't even know that was in the CARES Act as we think about all the coronavirus. So, can you tell us a little bit in terms of the limitations in financially being able to bank or do business or process payments and so forth in the cannabis industry for some people who may not be aware?
Sure. So because cannabis is currently federally illegal, right now you have cannabis business. There are some small credit unions and banks that do offer banking to cannabis businesses, but by and large, you won't see your Wells Fargo's, your Bank of America's, your SunTrust of the world, PNC's offering banking to cannabis businesses. Because since cannabis is still a Schedule One drug federally, they don't have access to banking. Another thing, and so that's the reason the Safe Banking Act is so important. Last year, it actually passed through the House of Representatives. It's the first piece of standalone cannabis legislation to ever pass through the House, and it's been sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk waiting to get a vote in the Senate since last year. The organization that I work for, the National Cannabis Industry Association, was instrumental in making sure that that was included in the first CARES relief package. And so we're like, again, we're working on having that coronavirus. I'm sorry, that the safe banking included in coronavirus relief bills, because for one, when you think of cannabis, not only is cannabis businesses, so by and large, cannabis businesses have to do business in cash. And so, for one, you have a public safety issue where you have a business like this where people are doing a business that makes millions of dollars and having to do it in cash. That means when I worked in a dispensary, when I got my paycheck at the end of 2 weeks, I got my paycheck in cash, right? Like think about that, like what that would be like when these people go to pay their taxes. I've heard stories of people taking trash bags to the tax office to go pay their taxes in cash. And since we're on taxes, another thing that's important to note is there's something called 280E in the U.S. tax code that says that people who are in an illegal drug business cannot write off business expenses. So cannabis, although it's legalized on a state level in many states, is still federally illegal. So cannabis business owners are not able to write off business expenses the way other business owners typically do, with the exception of cost of goods sold. So you have cannabis business owners paying about a 60% tax rate on any revenue they bring in. So that's the reason those are two important issues that whether people are for like cannabis being legalized, like for use, the fact that we already have a legal system that exists, I think many people from a political level can get behind supporting those types of things.
Now, we know some states have legalized. And so we know there are certain places where it's much easier, whether it be to buy or sell and use. What are some of those kind of top, maybe 3 or 4 states? And then maybe what are some of the bottom states in terms of places that have yet to either pass any type, whether it be medicinal, recreational, what have you?
Yeah. So now we currently have 33 states in the District of Columbia that have cannabis use legalized in some form, either medical or recreational. We also saw where the Farm Bill legalized hemp back in 2018. So we have hemp, which is I'll say marijuana's close cousin. And to give you more insight on that, what qualifies something as hemp, I'm sure you guys probably see CBD everywhere. In order to have that hemp classification, it must have less than 0.3% THC. So in cannabis, THC is the most well known what they call a cannabinoid, which actually is the intoxicant. So now you have hemp, which is fully legal. You have marijuana, like I said, 33 states in the District of Columbia. One of the largest cannabis market in the world is California. Not only in the country, not only do you have like a large regulated market there, but even when we talk about what I'll call the traditional or legacy market, which you all know because cannabis has only been legalized anywhere in the country for a number of years, about 75% of the cannabis in the country actually comes from California. So it's a huge market. We've recently seen where in the Midwest, some of the biggest states and opportunities in cannabis are in the Midwest. So of course you have Colorado, which was the first, along with along with Oregon to be the first states to actually legalize for adult use. But and so those are huge markets. But we're really seeing now where in the Midwest, states like Michigan and Illinois are really taking it off and doing it really big. Oklahoma's surprisingly also another big state where they have like more licenses than anybody else because they made it a system which with low barriers to entry so that people could participate in the market. So I'll say those Midwest markets are really something to look at. And then here on the East Coast, I believe I noted that New Jersey is overwhelmingly expected to pass legalization tomorrow when it's on the ballot. So that is going to be a huge market to watch, and it also has implications for the rest of the East Coast, where I would find it highly unlikely that folks in New York and Pennsylvania and their neighbors in all these other states are going to want to see Jersey getting all the revenue from cannabis, because especially as you think about the ability to actually tax cannabis, we're seeing where states they want to legalize, excuse me, because right now in coronavirus, where states' budgets are hurting, really having cannabis be legalized can add some extra revenue.
Now, for people that are, because we know there are many different levels to the industry itself. So there are the traditional, so that's what we know, all of the corner boys and so forth. So then we have the people that are taking it a step further. So they're maybe have grown their own plants at home. They might be making their own edibles and those kind of things. So, how would someone who's doing that from home then take that up a notch and maybe become a lot more profitable? So, get to the point where they're having to take trash bags worth of money to their local IRS.
Sure. So one good point to make is that less than 4% ownership of all cannabis businesses in the U.S. are owned by African Americans. It's less than 10% altogether when you look at Blacks and Latinos together. So by and large, we don't have a huge margin of participation in the industry. One of the biggest things that you can do is, I think, education. When we're talking about getting involved in the cannabis business, these are highly regulated and highly competitive markets. To give you an example, here in Maryland, one of the things that encouraged me to actually leave my job in finance was the opportunity to apply for licenses here in Maryland in 2019. And so there were over 250 applicants for 4 cultivation licenses and 10 processing licenses. So the odds alone in those are, super competitive. And part of what I had to do, I went to a state, the state of Maryland had a business development and training program, but it also took a lot of independent research and education on my own. One of the most well-known cannabis universities is called Oaksterdam out in Oakland, California. I took classes there. I took classes from an organization called Americans for Safe Access, and also another online university called Cannabis Training University. Now, in just a couple years, the market has advanced much more, where you have actually accredited colleges that even offer cannabis courses. The University of Maryland School of Pharmacy actually offers a cannabis science degree that you can get. I sit on the advisory board of Excelsior College, which is an online college up in New York. They offer a cannabis regulatory track and education. So I would say one of the first things you want to do is have some type of access to education that's recognized, because in terms of experience, what we typically know as traditional experience in the business world, they technically don't count it, right? Because how can you say I've been running the cannabis business for 10 years and apply that as experience if it wasn't legal? So I think one of the first things you need to do is whatever business you're operating, learn it, learn the market, learn to do it. But you want to, I'll say, add on top of that. One of the other things that I would say is networking. Of course, it's a lot harder to do that now because of COVID. But one of the things that I was doing back in 2018, 2019, when I was looking to get into the industry, every event that came through the DMV area, I was all over it. So the school in California, Tanya, that's Oaksterdam, Oaksterdam. And they actually even have online courses and everything that you can take now too. So it's a really good look. But so like I said, in terms of the education, I would look at that. I would also look at networking. The organization that I work for, the National Cannabis Industry Association, is an excellent resource. We have the Minority Cannabis Business Association, which is an amazing resource. We have Normal, the National Organization for the Regulation of Marijuana Laws. We have the Minorities for Medical Marijuana, Americans for Safe Access. There are a lot of different organizations where Women Grow is a great one for women that want to be involved in the cannabis industry. Yep, I will put all of those in the chat. So like I would definitely get involved in those organizations, attend webinars on the investment and finance side. There's a great organization called ArcView, ARCVIEW, and they have financial information. Data and information is such a huge part of this industry. Some great resources for that are ArcView that I just mentioned, as well as there's another company called BDS Analytics. New Frontier Data is another one, and another one is called Headset, like headphones, headset. So those are some good resources that you can go to get data about the industry.
Now, Kayla says, is CBD as profitable as selling regular THC?
It can be, but I'll say CBD is so competitive. Like right now, everybody and their mama has a CBD brand just because you can do it so easily, right? So I'll say if you have a lane and a market for it, I say 100% go for it, because the reason that CBD is such a lower barrier to entry because it's legal. Anybody can do it, right? THC, in order to like sell THC, you have to, again, it's a highly regulated market and it's super competitive. Like I said, here in Maryland last year, the license I applied for, they gave out 14 of them, and that's for the entire state. On top of, so like there's about 27 of each of those, like for the entire state of Maryland. So it's a lot more competitive. Against CBD, it can be profitable, but it's, like I said, it's just more competitive because it's such much more of a saturated market. One of the other things with hemp to keep in mind, though, is that hemp, they actually believe that the industrial uses of hemp will by far surpass the revenue that's created from CBD. And so when I say industrial uses, I mean the hemp can be used to make plastic, hemp can be used to make paper, hemp can be used to make concrete. I've seen people make installation from for their houses out of hemp. There's so many different uses. It pulls metals out of the ground, so it can help to remediate crops. There's so many industrial uses of hemp that, like, the hemp market, by far they actually do expect the hemp to outpace the revenue that cannabis has. Again, it's just trying to figure out where you get in, right? Like if you have the land, um, depending on where you're at, you could farm hemp right now and do it. So there, depending on your state, there are certain processes and procedures you have to go to, but it's something that can be easily done.
So I guess that's something that some of the ladies who has a bigger backyard, some acreage or what have you, that might be another project that you can pursue on the side as well. Now, what are some of the misconceptions about the industry? As people are, I'm sure you get some questions, comments, concerns, what have you. What are some of the common misconceptions when people think about the industry as a whole?
What I would say, I think the biggest misconception that I often hear is that people think to be in the cannabis industry, like you have to have a dispensary, or you have to be a grower, or you have to be making like vape cartridges or something like that. The cannabis industry is actually much bigger, right? And so I want people to expand their thinking. When you think of an industry, like there's an entire industry and infrastructure that surrounds the plant. So if you were an attorney, right, you could be an attorney that specializes in cannabis. If you're an architect, you could be an architect that specializes in cannabis. If you're in security or IT or accounting, or you're like any of those things, there's definitely a niche, because, like, again, the industry needs all these moving parts. So when you actually look at it, so for example, the Cannabis Industries Trade Association, which I belong to, if you actually look at what the makeup of the people that I interact with the most, the majority of them are people that are in those ancillary businesses supporting the industry. just because that's where more of the opportunity is. So I'd always try to recommend people that they kind of reframe the way they think of it. That's one of the biggest things. One of the other things that I would say is that you would think that it's simple, but it's really super complex. Where like cannabis, and I think by now people really know this, but it's a highly capital intensive business and it's highly competitive. It's not as simple as just being like, oh, I know how to grow some good weed, or like like whatever, and to be able to get in, because there's so many different barriers to entry. I was actually before we got on the Zoom, before everybody joined, I was actually saying that I know people here personally that applied for licenses here. They spent, I know people personally that spent $750,000 to apply for a license and then did not win. So it's not guaranteed. You don't get your money back like when you apply. So there's a lot of risks that go into it. Also, I've had the experience of actually scoring an application for a state's cannabis program. So I've seen the disparity where you have some people coming in saying that they're backed by hundreds of millions of dollars in a fund, and then where you have other people saying that they're pulling friends and family members or mortgaging their house or things like that. So again, it's such a tough industry, and those are some of the things that we're working on, or me personally and people that I work together with in the industry are trying to solve, because is of so of course I gave a statistic earlier where people of color are only own about 4% of ownership in the industry. On the flip side of that, African Americans are 4 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis. So 4 times more likely to be arrested, but also only 4% ownership. So that number four, I think, is kind of important as you look at the cannabis industry.
Now, as you talk about being able to look at different parts of the industry and being able to enter in different parts of the industry, and then the capital needed, if people are thinking of raising capital or figuring out if they're going to take a mortgage against their home and so forth, what would you think would be a good number, kind of a good starting place?
Well, again, is the thing is, and this is the reason banking is so important, because if you were starting any other business, right? Like you said, you wanted to start a barber shop, you could put together a business plan and you could walk into the bank and say, hey, here's my business plan. It's the revenue I'm going to make. Let me get a loan. In order to do that in cannabis, you would literally have to be self-funding or have access to private equity, venture capitalists that would privately fund your business. Personally, if I were, and this is me putting my old financial advisor hat on, I would never advise somebody to like I mean, I couldn't in good conscience be like mortgage your house and like to try to go after the industry. And I also in good conscience wouldn't recommend anybody do what I did either. Like I left a job where I made, and this is where I also try to share my story to be fully transparent. I left a job where I made $100,000 per year to go be like when I said that patient counselor, it wasn't a glamorous thing. I left a job where I made over $100,000 a year to go make $15 an hour, in terms of the investment that I made in myself to do it. So now I was lucky enough to get to the position that I'm in, but I'll say not many people actually achieve that. So, of course, while it's always good to bet on yourself, like I said, I would have a hard time because, like I said, I'll just be honest, I haven't recouped what I made before. Right now, through some of these investments that I've done and things that I've done, probably will likely pay off within the next year or two. But like yeah, like I said, if you have a good job, maybe think twice about it before you make the jump.
This is why it's important to be financially independent so you can make choices and decisions and pivots and so forth. So I think that's a big thing. And you were kind of going on this before. What are some of the mistakes that people make as they're getting into the industry? So don't mortgage your house. But what would be some of the other mistakes that you think people make?
Yeah, well, I'll say also again, going putting that financial advisor hat on, right? It starts with a plan. So, like you said, it did come with some financial independence because, like, I planned this out. I knew that this was the industry I was going to go into, so I started preparing my savings like well before, right? If I didn't have money to make sure that my mortgage was paid during those months where I was learning that low income, I could have never been able to do it, right? If I didn't have the support of a significant other, had an income to supplement, I wouldn't have been able to do it. When you talk about mistakes that one can make, one of the easy ones that I could say is, um, I think that if your goal is to be in the legal cannabis industry, and this is just my personal opinion, some people may feel differently. For me, when I decided, when I made the decision I wanted to be in the legal cannabis industry, I personally decided that I didn't want to be involved with anything that had to do with like the traditional market because um, so for example, here in Maryland where I applied, in most places and a lot of places actually, if you have like a felony, or in some places, even if you have charges for cannabis, you can be disqualified from even participating. And so, as crazy as that sounds, right, you're going to tell some people that they can legally do it, but if I have a charge, I can't participate. So, one of the worst things that could happen as you're on the road to trying to do this that could derail everything would be getting a charge, trying to get the little check to keep you from getting the big check. That's just one thing that I think. Another thing that's important is as you go out and if you do pursue the industry, it's important to understand the understanding finance is so important, and like just deals and is so important because you often have a lot of people that take advantage of the fact that we don't have. So you'll see companies where someone may approach and say, hey, why don't you on paper, why don't you say that you own this company, right? Like Tahir, we're going to say this is your company, but in reality, when you look at the operating agreement, that person actually doesn't own the company, and you have people of color that are being used as fronts to try to go after these opportunities. So I think it's important to understand the same rules in business apply. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is, and nobody's giving out anything for free. So I think it's important to anything that you learned in business outside of cannabis. It's important to apply that as well. And then, like I said, I think one of the other things, just going back to something I mentioned before, is people often spend a lot of time. One of the biggest mistakes that you can make would be trying to pursue the cannabis industry. If you could be much more, I'm sorry, being the actual plant touching business in the industry, if you could be much more successful doing something else. And I'll give you the perfect example. Earlier this year, I was in Missouri at a cannabis conference. I met a guy there. He has like his CPA. He said he specialized in like forensic accounting for like all of these years. And he was like, yeah, he was like, he's like, I want to be in cannabis. I want to be a grower. And he was like, he had already decided he was about to leave his job. He was to all pursue, like to start learning how to be a cannabis grower. And I had the same conversation with him. I'm like, dude, you got all these years of experiences background doing that. That same day, I was able to introduce him to someone that owns a cannabis accounting firm so that he could potentially get a job, right? Like whatever skills that you've built up for all these years, if you say that you want to be in this, you don't have to necessarily like throw it all away in order to get involved. And that's something that I'll say that I probably learned the hard way, but I would want you to learn from my mistakes.
That's huge. Now, I imagine there's no directory in terms of these ancillary businesses where you're not the actual grower. But yes, if you have a finance background or HR background or whatever that might be, you can actually be in the industry without directly touching the industry. So, how would you? I guess that might be through some of that networking or through some of those organizations you named. Is that
Oh,
the
yeah.
best ways?
Well, some of the best ways I'll tell you are actually some of those traditional job channels, right? Like Indeed, there's a ton of cannabis jobs on Indeed. On LinkedIn, LinkedIn is the place for cannabis. Like I'll tell you, like I literally on my personal LinkedIn on the low end, I probably get like 10 to 20 requests every day from people in the cannabis industry or people that want to be in the cannabis industry and that are doing all different types of things. For me, I recommend people if you're serious about wanting to get in it, and I also understand that professionally, it can be something difficult. But by putting cannabis on your LinkedIn profile, it actually will. Uh, you'll see that you'll get people that are interested and want to start sharing information. There's also cannabis specific like hiring and kind of like platforms. So, for example, one of the big ones, there's one called Flower Hire, and that's flower like flower hire, like hire for a job. Another big one is Vangst, that's Vangst. So there are like whole recruiting firms that are out there. So in markets where they're bigger markets, like, that are more developed, there's certainly more opportunities. But I would tell you, go on Indeed as a test. Like when you get off of here or right now, open up Indeed and type in cannabis in your state and see what comes up. And you'll find that a lot of actual professional jobs. There's jobs for auditors. There's jobs for IT. That any job any career that you could get in any other industry exists in this industry as well.
Now that's a gem right there. I don't think anybody else, most people weren't thinking about that. I think the misconception is just that everything is so underground, but it's definitely becoming more of a larger industry to be a part of. And like the education you talked about, you can pay for it, you can get that on the job training. And some of that might come from those transferable skills of what you already know.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you talked a little bit about your license process. Can you share a little bit about what that looks like so people might be able to prepare if they were looking to do the same?
Sure. So some in the licensing process, there's a number of things that we had to do to be able to do it, right? So in Maryland, to give you more of a, I'll say, deeper look at what the requirements were. This last round that they did here was to benefit the requirements in order to get all the points on the application. You had to be an African American or Native American with a net worth of less than 1.7 million. The state also identifies 60 different zip codes. I guess you could call them opportunity zones, if you will, that were the places that were that were the most impacted by the war on drugs, where they wanted to give preference for these businesses. So in terms of actually being able to successfully apply for the license, there were a number of different things. We had to have the building plan, like the exact layout. We had to go back and forth with people in the community to get their blessing to sign off and say, hey, we're going to allow them to be there. In some political districts, that can be tougher to do than others. We had to secure a property. We had to do a diversity plan. We actually had to, in applying for the application, we had to hire and get like kind of hiring contract agreements with all of our potential employees. And we had to actually, it was a good amount of money. In my team, we didn't put up as much money as other people that I heard, and that was because we were able to do it through our own experience. So, for example, again, me coming from finance, I was able to do work on the financial plan. We had a number of attorneys that were part of our team. Former, we had a real estate person as our team, actual people that are dispensary owners. So I'll say it's a lot more than, in my opinion, one person can do on your own. I'll say it takes a team. So I will formulate, what you think that looks like, and I will also say, don't wait until it's coming to try to get started. It's one of those things where if you're already ready, you don't have to get ready. So if you live in one of those states where cannabis isn't even legal yet, I would just be like searching, trying to find out what's going on with the legislation so that you can be prepared before it even comes. Because the process to go through the entire thing in Maryland, it probably took us about 18 months of work to be able to be prepared to successfully submit that application. So that's definitely, you're going to need somebody with the expertise to grow. You don't necessarily have to do it yourself if you're going for cultivation. And so that's where being able to find people from other markets with more experience, especially if you're somewhere where it's new, can be helpful as well.
Now, putting together that entire team, is there a resource to go to as you're putting together your team? So is there, obviously this wouldn't be like a traditional business plan or what have you. Where would you go, or what resources to figure out who do you need on the team?
You know what? There really is. If you want to give me a second, I can go grab one of the books that I use that kind of has some of this information. Like I said, there to be honest, there, and that's the thing, and that's the reason they're so competitive, because there really is no like definition. I will tell you one thing that's the key that you can do. In a lot of states, you can actually look up the redacted applications, so that you can see other people's applications that they actually put in. So for example, if you were to go to the Maryland Medical Cannabis Commission website, I don't remember the exact spot off the top of my head, but you can actually pull up like all of those redacted applications that everybody submit, like the names and stuff aren't on there. And anything that's like a trade, like a business secret, that would be covered up as well. But like just that general process to see like who's a part of that team, like you can see that. And then I would also look at some of these like publicly traded cannabis companies out there to kind of look at their team and see what it's made up of. You know what I mean? You can and so they like some of the other, like you can go on the websites for like, again, like look at the websites for the big ones, like the Acreage Holdings, the Harvest Cannabis, Curaleaf, is the largest cannabis company in the world. And like I said, look at some of how the structures and the experience of that some of the people have on their team.
Now, you mentioned the publicly traded, and someone asked about cannabis stocks. So, if that's something they want to do in order to get involved, almost a passive way to be involved in the industry, what does that process look like? And what are you seeing on that side of the house? I mean, both, especially coming from the financial advisor world.
Absolutely. So cannabis stocks are volatile to say the least, right? So last year, if you look at 2019, we're starting to see where there's been some rebound recently because cannabis is essential, is one of the only businesses, like even very early on in coronavirus, every state with a legal the cannabis program was still operational. So if you imagine, you remember back in the beginning of coronavirus, only places you could go was to the grocery store, the liquor store, and the dispensary, right? So we're seeing now we're starting to rebound. But if you looked at cannabis stocks last year, I mean, they were hurting. Some of them down 50%, huge margins. But they also previously, like the year before, had gone up as well. So I would say with the same advice, what I typically told people as an investment advisor is you don't want to be over concentrated to any specific asset or class, right? So cannabis absolutely should be a part of your portfolio. I would consider it to be a growth play akin to like if you think of like the investing in tech stocks like early 90s, right? Like this is the same type deal. There's going to be winners and losers, but the ones that are winners and that are going to be around are going to be big. Um, the other points to make is, I mean, there aren't a whole lot. As a matter of fact, I'm going to drop the um, new cannabis ventures. If you Google new cannabis ventures, that is the best resource that I found for cannabis investor data. It's ran by a gentleman named Alan. What's his last name? Brock something, and he's a CFA. So for those of us that come from investment world, like in terms of investment analysts, that's like the one of the highest levels you can go to. So they have great information on all different types of information there. Um, in terms of investing, this is one of the other things I'll say at Jim. Like the large publicly traded cannabis companies are actually available on platforms like they're like on Robinhood, Cash App. There's only 4 of them that are like available there, and they're like the Canadian ones is Chronos, Altria, Canopy, and one other one. I have to look at my portfolio to see it, but some of the other ones, like you can actually because they are available. Again, like U.S. cannabis companies are listed on the Canadian market, and it's again another thing because cannabis being federally illegal. So you have to it can be a little bit more difficult to find all of the companies, but you have opportunities there. Excuse me 1 second, I hear a little one crying.
And ladies, definitely make sure if you have questions to drop those in the chat. But we have a lot of ladies that have talked about what they're doing, kind of their next steps and so forth. So if you're at step 1, if you're doing 1 or 2, or you're looking to go bigger and really pursue kind of the bigger license and have your own dispensary, please share that with us as well. We'd love to know kind of where you are in your journey. And hopefully we can figure out how to get you further along in the journey as well.
Yeah, I'd definitely be glad to answer any specific questions anybody has about their particular situation, and share some insight on it if I can be helpful.
Now, kind of back to the stocks and so forth, I would think, I mean, no one has their crystal ball, but in terms of what might happen in the next, let's say, 6 months to a year, depending on what happens, of course, tomorrow in so many of these states where there's something on the ballot related to it. And then, of course, as we look at where the administration goes from a national level, what do you think that might actually do to the market in general, especially from a financial perspective?
Oh, absolutely. We see legalization take place, then it's a game changer, right? All of these numbers that all these huge numbers that I put out, we're talking about something that is still federally illegal, and it's making pulling in the money like this. So imagine when it is legalized, it's we're talking a completely different ball game. But we're also talking about where we'll see different players that are not traditional cannabis companies are involved right now come in and get involved, right? Like when cannabis is legalized, what's stopping Big Pharma from coming in? What's stopping Coca-Cola from saying, Coca-Cola from saying they want to make a cannabis drink? Constellation Brands, which owns Coronavirus, is actually one of the largest investors in Canopy Growth, which is one of the largest cannabis companies. They own like 60 some percent of it or something like that. So that's already telegraphing that, like, once this thing becomes legalized, again, big tobacco, the whole market changes. I think changes then once we see it legalized, but it's still going to be a great opportunity. And the other thing to think of in terms of cannabis is that there's not just these investments that you can make in publicly traded companies, but also investments, private investments that you can make in companies. And when I say that, I mean there's like small owned, small businesses, right? Essentially, a lot of the cannabis businesses, there we have like those large mega corporations, but we also have like mom and pop corporations. So, if you were like an accredited investor, you could potentially invest in like a black owned cannabis business and help, help fund the business. And that's an opportunity to get a potential stake of ownership as well. So if you're an investor and you have money, your way to getting on one of these licenses might not be, you don't have to be the person that knows how to grow, right? You might be the person with the checkbook, and that's part of a partnership as well.
Now, I think that's big in and of itself because there's so many people that are saying, well, I don't necessarily want to get my hands dirty. I don't want to be the grower. And their education in terms of all the different aspects of the industry might not be as robust as they'd like it to be. But this is still a great opportunity. Now, if they were looking for some of those private investments, where would they go to find that information?
Now with that one, I would say you would probably have to know the people, right? Because it's one thing. So, for example, like the dispensary that I started working at, and this is one of those things where if you imagine like people in this industry, just because it's so attractive, they likely get so many people like hitting them up left and right. I was talking to one person that was at a cannabis company. They said like literally like the day that they post a job, they'll have like hundreds of applications within like hours. Like it might be like a couple of hours. I think this person said that they had like a job post a couple of hours and they had like 300 some applications. So all these people are getting hit up. But I would say where I was going with that is like by patronizing the business, right? Like I could never get through by email or by telephone. But when I became a patient at the dispensary and started going in, walking and getting to know the people, that was how I made the connection. Again, LinkedIn is another good place. Like I'll say everybody that I know that are like cannabis business owners, they have not just LinkedIn though, all social media. Like most of them will have an Instagram page. They'll probably have a Facebook. You could do your research, and I'll say put very if you really wanted to support a black owned cannabis business, there really are not that many like out there in the world. And like typically like you'll see where people have put together these lists, right? Like a black cannabis business owners. You look at one of those, you likely are looking at like, and I don't say it like to be sarcastic, like you're likely looking at like every black person in the cannabis industry. There's not that many. So I would just say find how to connect with them and tell them that you're interested in investing. But I will also say they tend to be like higher amounts that they're looking for, because if you think of like a cannabis business, just the inventory alone, right? Like I mean, it can't be like, it's not going to, like if you say like, hey, I'm going to invest like $5,000, $10,000, likely that's not going to move the needle for somebody like on a private investment. They're probably talking numbers like 50, 100 or better than that for percentages. So
I think that's good information. One thing you mentioned is the war on drugs. And so we know how this has looked over the past few decades. What do you think the legalization will do for the illegal drug portion of the world?
yeah, well, one of the most important parts of the conversation is social equity. It hasn't always been a part of, but one of the big things that advocates are pushing for now is to make sure that anywhere where there is legalization, these same people that have been criminalized have the opportunity to participate in the industry. The MORE Act, the one that I've mentioned, is currently waiting to be voted on in Congress. Could be a huge impact to that. Um, and be so some of the things that should be a part of social equity are not only opportunities for people to have ownership in cannabis businesses, but also for expungement, right? Like for people that are actually locked up to be released from jail. If you there's no reason that you should be saying that in one state you can have people that are out legally selling something and other people actually in jail for it at the same time. So that's a huge part of it. Another part is like we talked about how capital intensive it can be, making sure that there's funds to actually support people that want to get in the industry, making sure that there's capital available. For example, in Portland, Oregon, they just announced their fund. The application for the fund just closed October 30th. They set aside $800,000 in grants to be able to give to the community for people that want to participate in the industry. So that's another huge part of it. There's money, there's expungement, there's also the fact that when we're talking about the community that's been harmed by the war on drugs, we're not just talking about people with charges, right? People that are from these same communities, that are other business people that have bared the brunt of this as well, should have opportunities to participate in the industry too. And when we say that, it shouldn't just be ownership. That like that money from cannabis taxes should be going back into these same communities to improve the communities, schools, opioid use reduction, all different types of training and education program, libraries in these communities. So I think a part of where you see the conversation going now is making sure that as we do have legalization, that the people that have been really harmed by this are getting the opportunity to have that rectified some as well.
I think that's huge too. You talked about diversity in the industry itself. And so these diversity initiatives, and we know that diversity is kind of like the tagline today. So as we talk about the tag in terms of, are people more diversified? Are are businesses more diversified, and so forth? Now, how are people able to take advantage of kind of this new initiative to have more diversified businesses, or is that kind of very much on the front end when we think about the cannabis industry?
Yeah, I'll say so right now because cannabis, the way the markets are set up, each market in each state is completely different. And there's not like one blanket type of there's not one type of blanket set of regulations that covers. So what social equity looks like in Maryland will look completely different than what it looks like in DC or Virginia next door. So each state has set up their own set of rules and laws, and some states don't have it as part of their program at all. So I would say it's important to look at whatever state you decide that you want to do business in, and do research, and like I'll say, research what the specific laws are there, because some places may actually be giving out some money. Some places like Massachusetts have certain license types that they've set aside. So, for example, the delivery license in Massachusetts, they've said they're going to give social equity operators a 3-year exclusivity to operate those licenses. And so there's a number of different types of things, and it looks different in every place.
And then would you need to be a resident as you're going after some of these licenses and so forth? Would you need to, so if you're going after Maryland, do you need to live in Maryland or Colorado and live in Colorado?
Yep. So some states have residency requirements, but a lot of them don't. Again, it like for Maryland, there wasn't any type of residency requirement. That was a part of it. In some other places, you get extra points. You get extra points for like being a resident, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you win. The other thing is that in certain states, they might have things where like you have to have been a resident for like a certain amount of time, but then also it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody has to be right. Like say you gotta I use Oklahoma as a good example, right? Like Oklahoma is it was very inexpensive and there's no cap on the number of licenses. Like I said, here in Maryland there's like 20 something to service the whole state. Literally there's no cap there. So like if you said you want to get in the cannabis business and you got a cousin or a homie or something in Oklahoma, maybe you just hit them up and say, "Yo, what's up, cuz? Let's do this license." You know what I'm saying? Because it's literally that simple. I want to say the application is like $300 or like something like that. And there is some type of residency requirement there. But again, every state looks different. And so you can strategize how you want to do and think. I'll say think long term. I think a good example of that is one of my good friends. His name is Shayun Adetaji. He's the youngest black man to own a dispensary in the country, and he started out in Oregon, which is a completely saturated like market. And he opened up his dispensary there. I want to say like 2017. But by going there, he was able to get the experience and the track record of actually operating a business. Now he just opened up his dispensary in Massachusetts last week and was the second black cannabis business in the state, and he's like one of the first, like I want to say like maybe the first black-owned cannabis business on the East Coast, and one of the few that have multi-state operations. So just by him, like so when he was doing it in Oregon, he wasn't making a whole lot of money. He actually was like he was sleeping in his shop to get by, right? But now he's in a completely different position. So just by making that investment and having some strategy, I think also realizing again we're in the very early innings of this. So like where I mentioned that there's 30, 33, let's say 34 states in DC now where it's legal, that means there's still a whole bunch where it isn't. So like when that comes, if you're the people with what I've seen in cannabis, there's two things that really separate the success from the not success, and their experience and capital. And the only way you get experience is by actually having experience in a regulated, like a legal market. And the only way you got capital is, hey, you got to have it. And people from our communities typically don't have access to it. So.
Oh, this is amazing information. Ladies, let me know if you have any more questions. But as we're waiting on final questions, any final remarks? So as people are kind of thinking about it, they're debating if they should, they're saying, yeah, I'm kind of interested. Maybe they're doing a little something and they want to go from being, whatever it is, the kitchen baker to really owning something and being bigger than the 4%. And so taking that 4 to 5%, what would those closing remarks be and those kind of recommendations in terms of the next steps? You gave us a good bit of things, but what would some of those things be?
Yeah, for sure. So one thing, and not to plug myself, but I have a podcast called the Cannabis Diversity Report, and every week I host different guests that are other minorities in the industry, talking about their journey in the industry and the type of business they have. Some of them are actual like cannabis business owners, and some of them like plant touching businesses, and some of them are people that provide services, like I mentioned. Like a couple weeks ago, I had my friend Jessica Gonzalez, who's an attorney that specializes in intellectual property for the cannabis industry. The last episode I did, I just had Biggie's son on there, who has a cannabis business that he's launched. I had people that have cannabis festivals, or like, so you can get so much different perspective on like what that actually looks like. And I always have people share like how they transitioned and got into the industry. I think it's important that although it is true that there's not a lot of us in the industry and it's tough, I hate the narrative that it's impossible, right? So I love to be able to show like people that have actually done it and how they did it so that we can follow the blueprint and the example to be able to get in. That's one thing. And then yeah, like I said, it's not impossible. Like I said, it does take a lot of hard work. The odds are stacked against us, but it can, the payoff in the end, if you are successful, can be big. And again, like I said, just continue to think outside the box. And when you say you want to get in the cannabis industry, what you think that opportunity looks like, because it may not be what you think, right? Like literally, I have a job where I work for an organization lobbying for federal cannabis policy reform. We have our office on the Hill, and people like most people think that like when their only point of reference to cannabis is a dispensary. So we have people knocking on the door on our office on the Hill, when we were in the office, saying, "Hey, can I buy an eighth?" And it's like, "No, we don't sell weed." Think of it like you don't have to sell weed to be in the cannabis industry, although you can. So that would be my last bit of advice.
I love it. So I was trying to get as much stuff into the chat as you were going. So I've dropped a few of the things that he discussed. I know a few people wanted to know about the classes, so I'll get that information from you and drop that in as well. I'm going to drop in the link for your LinkedIn profile. I have added your podcast in there as well. So definitely an array of information. I want to thank you so much for joining us, for being a part of our chat tonight. And ladies, I want you to know that, like I said, like he said, you don't have to actually be a grower. You don't have to actually sell an eighth. You could really be in the industry in so many different ways and really pivot. So if you're feeling that burnout, if you're feeling like I want to do something a tad bit different, but you have these skills already, those skills are transferable to another industry, and an industry that is just like whatever other industry that you might be working in today. And so if you're not 100% ready to kind of jump out and own a dispensary or what have you, there's so many options and so many resources that are out there. So I want to thank you all again for joining us as always. And I will copy all of this over into the Facebook group as well. And so I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I'm sure the ladies will reach out to you with some specific questions as well.
Sure, please do. And I'm dropping as many. I'm trying to remember all the different things that I mentioned, just dropping as many different names in the chat as I can. But I'm always glad to help. Like literally, I do this because I believe that it's important to share the knowledge that I've been able to amass by doing it. So feel free to reach out, whether it's LinkedIn, whatever platform, and I'm glad to help.
All right, you got a whole bunch of likes, a whole bunch of loves as well in the group. So the ladies are loving the information. And I know a few ladies that are in kind of the first parts of getting their business started. So I just want to congratulate them in advance and just know that we have a lot of information that is readily available for them so they can reach out, check out some of these resources, and get all of the information that's out there. So thank you again for joining us, and let us know what else we can do for you.
Absolutely. Thank you all. Like she said, if anybody that is if you're starting a business, especially those folks when they're starting a business, I'm glad to help them. I'm just a message away. So feel free to take me up on it.
Perfect. Thank you so much, and good night, everybody.
Bye.